everybody, welcome to the Ronline Report. This is a man I've been waiting to get on here for a while. So happy to have him here. This is a guy who inspired me in the very, very beginning. I had his pictures up on my wall. Couldn't wait to see him in the magazines, on stage, and so on. Mass with Class, Lee Labrada. Thank you, Lee, for joining us today.
Hey, Ron, it's really a pleasure to be here and to be with all of our viewers out there for muscular development.
Cool. First thing I have to ask, because you're in the Houston area, I want to make sure you're okay, everybody you know is okay?
Yes, by the grace of God, our home was high and dry, and so was our business. Others were not so fortunate, and Houston really was hit very hard. And but everybody came together. Everybody pitched in to help, and all of the first responders did a fabulous job. And so now we're cleaning up the mess, so to speak. But I think it's going to be months.
Yeah, I'm sure. Florida, obviously, Florida's going to have a tough road too.
Yeah. Yeah, now Florida's getting hit. It's just unbelievable. Two of these monsters back to back.
Okay. Now, I know a lot of the younger viewers are not familiar with who you are exactly, your accomplishments, so I always start these interviews off with a little bit of background to educate them. First of all, you were born in an amazing country that also produced my wife, Cuba, yes?
Yes, I didn't know that you were married to a Cuban girl.
Oh my goodness, it's been a long time now, Lee. 26 years and counting.
Have you learned to speak any Spanish?
Oh, hablo mucho español. Hablo español como cubano también. Yeah.
Very good.
I have the perfect Cuban accent. I was actually in Havana last year.
That's great. That's great.
Have you been back recently at all?
I have not been back since we emigrated in the early 1960s.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
That's on my bucket list.
Oh yeah, I'm sure you would appreciate it much more than I did, being there from there and all. So take me back to the very early days. I don't even remember how you got into bodybuilding. How did you get into bodybuilding?
So I got into bodybuilding when I was in high school, and I noticed that there was a competition coming up, the Teenage Mr. Jacksonville, Florida, and that was way back in the late 70s, back when the AAU was putting those on. And I trained for 6 months for it, competed, and I won the show. And I got to tell you that nobody was more surprised than I was, because I was probably the smallest guy in the show, and I thought it was all about being big. Yeah. And I rapidly found out that bodybuilding, competitive bodybuilding, was not just about mass. It was about symmetry, proportion, being in great shape, and just the way you're put together.
Yeah, and if anybody would teach the bodybuilding world a lesson over the years that followed, it was you.
Well, so, thank you. Thank you.
Before we even get to the competitive record, there's one thing I think you don't get much credit for. It's that I believe that you were training HIT style long before Dorian, and it was in the magazines and publicized, but Dorian kind of got credit for being the one that brought that into the sport.
Well, actually, if you go back into the 70s, Bob Kennedy, the late founder of Muscle Mag magazine, was one of the first proponents of high-intensity training. And I believe that the pro bodybuilder that did the most to popularize high-intensity training was Mike Metzer. Yeah. Starting in the late 70s, going into the early 80s. And certainly he was one of my idols as I was growing up as a teenager. And so that's where I got my first taste of high-intensity training. And people would look at my physique and say, "You built that in high-intensity training?" Because I've got a more symmetrical, more classical look, and not one of these mass monsters. But the same thing that builds the muscles for a larger guy builds the muscles for a smaller guy. And I'm a firm believer in intensity, the amount of work that you do in a certain amount of time.
Yeah. Now, I believe you studied engineering. Did you earn your engineering degree?
I did. I studied civil engineering at Northwestern University, and then later at University of Houston.
So, having that analytical approach, do you think that carried over quite a bit into your bodybuilding career in any way?
Ron, I think it does to this day. It's just a way of thinking that engineering teaches you to pull apart problems and analyze things, yes.
Okay. All right, so let's delve into your career, your amateur career. You turned pro back when you still had to, now it's a little easier, obviously, but you won the middleweights at the 85 Nationals, which now, even second place would have got your pro card. But you had to go on to the World Championships from there.
Right. It's amazing. But back in the day, and we're talking 1985 now.
Yeah.
Back in the day, if you won your class at the Nationals, you went on to compete in the IFBB Mr. Universe. And if you won your class there, then you got a pro card.
Yeah.
You know, so it was a lot more difficult to get pro cards back then, and I would say probably less than a half a dozen pro cards were given out every year at that time. But I won my class at the '85 Nationals, and then 2 weeks later, I won the IFBB Mr. Universe, the middleweight, and the judges told me afterwards that had there been an overall, I would have won the overall as well.
Wow. And, you know, you certainly proved, you know, that you were worthy of being a pro, more than worthy of a pro, because May of the next year, you made your pro debut at the Night of Champions, and you won the whole thing.
That's right.
Certainly, I'm sure you were beating guys that were more than 176 pounds there.
I was, you know, at that point, I was giving away, you know, a 50-pound advantage. You know, and again, Ron, I got to tell you, no one was more surprised about winning that show than I was, because here I was, you know, competing against a lot of the guys that I had only read about in the magazines for years and years before, and I was stepping on stage with them, and so I didn't know what to expect. You know, but as things turned out, I won my pro debut at the Night of Champions, and was on my way.
Yeah, and yeah, as you went on, you had an amazing Olympia career too. First Mr. Olympia, it looks like, was your debut with Gothenburg, Sweden in 1987.
That's right.
Third place behind Lee Haney, the 8-time eventual winner, and Rich Gaspari, both of whom would be basically your main rivals over the next few years as a pro, correct?
That's right. That's right. And so that was just an incredible way to start out, you know, my professional years. And I was just really just floored that I was able to stand up on stage with these guys, all great bodybuilders.
Yeah. So I'm just going to run through your Olympia career briefly, and then we can touch on each one for a little bit. 1988, fourth place. Then you won 3 Grand Prix shows following that show. 1989, second place. We'll get to that in a minute. 1990, second place. 1991, fourth. 1992, third. 1993, fourth was your last one. You were never lower than fourth place at the Mr. Olympia.
7 consecutive years, never less than fourth.
So I think probably the ones worth talking about the most are the ones where, you know, to this day, some people say, Lee probably should have won that one. So let's start off at Rimini, Italy, 1989. If I recall from the photos, both 89 and 90, Lee was not at, the other Lee, Haney was not at his best, not quite as sharp, maybe a little watery looking in Rimini, but you were hard as nails from what I recall. So, you know, how did that show go for you? Did you think at any point?
Well, you know, I felt that I had a good shot at the title, and certainly not taking anything away from Lee Haney, because arguably one of 2 of the greatest bodybuilders of all time, as far as I'm concerned, and certainly dominated the 80s. So you know, taking second place to Lee Haney was it was not a consolation prize. You know, so. With all due respect, I felt that I was in great condition. I felt it could have gone either way. You know, as the cards fell, it went his way, you know, and the rest is history, as they say, you know.
Yeah. So next year was a really controversial second place. 1990, Chicago. This was the only year that they did full spectrum drug testing for steroids and everything else at the Mr. Olympia. A couple guys, like Mike Christian, were suspiciously looked exactly the same, whereas most of the lineup was definitely a little smaller, a little softer, particularly the champ Lee Haney. You know, I'm going to just speculate that a larger guy would probably have a tougher time doing a show clean than a smaller guy for various reasons. You know, you didn't look that much worse for wear. You still brought a very impressive package. And
Thank you.
Believe you were leading, you were winning after the judging, were you not?
Ron, I was the only man in Olympia history to lead Lee Haney after a prejudging.
Wow.
You know, nobody else did that. And I thought that I had the contest wrapped up. You know, but again, certainly losing to Lee Haney is, you know, is not an embarrassment. He is a great athlete and a great Mr. Olympia.
Right. So what did it come down to? The posing round?
Ron, I think it's all speculation at this point. Could I have been harder? I dare say I could have, but so could have all of the other athletes.
Yeah.
Posing, I don't know. I've always led in the posing rounds, that type of a thing. So I'm not sure. But at the end of the day, I am just grateful that I was able to compete in that era and with those great athletes. Just an amazing experience.
Yeah, you mentioned posing, and you're still known as one of the greatest posers. When I do some posing coaching, and there's only a few guys I tell to look up on YouTube and watch their routines. And Lee Labrada, that's a name I always bring up. Go to YouTube, look at some of Lee Labrada's routines, look at Bob Paris, Francis Benfato, Frank Zane. These were the guys that really put some grace, some beauty, some style. So, were you always a good poser? Was this something that took you years to develop? How much time did you devote to it?
It's something that I worked at. It is something that I worked at. Because I was giving away such a big advantage in terms of my body weight, competing against guys that were 30, 40, and 50 pounds bigger, I knew that I had to have all of the details right. I had to be perfectly in condition. I had to have a perfect presentation. That included posing. And so I put a lot of time into working on my posing. I believe that my posing was different for the time, and the choice from everything from the choice of music to the choice of the different moves. And I feel to this day that posing is where the art meets the athleticism, and this is where we display what we've worked on in the gym. So it's an art form, and I think that what's lost on a lot of the guys nowadays is that posing is more than static poses. So it's more than just hitting a side tricep shot, or hitting a double bicep, or it's the motion, the flow that goes from pose to pose. That's a pose also. That's a dynamic pose, as I like to explain it. So I think that it's very important to demonstrate the body in an artful way.
Right. Because hitting classical poses and all this, that's great. It's not that hard to do, but to flow with these transitions and make those look just as captivating as the poses, that's another level. And that's something very few people excelled at. You're one of them.
And Ron, if I might add, if I might inject, for those of you that are watching and want to learn more about posing, I've got a free series of posing videos that they can find on the internet. They're all over YouTube. You can find them on my website, labrada.com. It's called Posing Like a Pro. And it's a 9-part series that was professionally produced that teaches bodybuilders how to pose.
Wow, that's very cool of you to give that for free, gotta say. What's your YouTube channel, Lee?
So the Labrada Nutrition YouTube channel.
Okay, cool. Were you happy to see Arnold Schwarzenegger a couple of years back, or was it last season? He brought back scoring for the posing rounds, which had been gone for 30, 40 years or something.
I think that this is a step in the right direction, and I think classic bodybuilding is a step in the right direction.
Yeah. Yeah, let's touch on that for a second. When that was introduced early last season, 2016, what were your thoughts? What did you think it was going to be like, and what were your anticipations for that division?
Well, I knew that it was going to be one of these things where there was going to be a slow start, but a steady build. And before the classic physique, classic bodybuilding washed up on American shores, the head of the IFBB, Rafael Santoja, had told me that it was growing phenomenally in Europe, that he'd never seen anything like it. And I knew then that this was going to be a vehicle that was going to bring bodybuilding within reach of the majority of the population, once again, the way it was in the 70s and the 80s. The open bodybuilding has gone so far in the direction of rewarding mass to the exclusion of other physical factors that it's really lost touch. And I think that classic bodybuilding could one day overtake the open.
Now, do you think that they should change the title to classic bodybuilding?
No, I think that at the end of the day, it's bodybuilding. You know, it's just I think we've lost touch with our classical roots.
Yeah. So when you're looking at classic physique coverage now versus open coverage, which one are you more interested in?
You know, honestly, I'm interested in both. I'm interested in classic bodybuilding because I see a renaissance. We're going through a renaissance period now, you know, some of the hardcore people listening to me would dispute that, but the fact is that open bodybuilding has a shrinking audience. And the extremes that it's going to, I think, are going to limit it. You know, so it's going to become one of those things where they're like the top fuel dragsters. Those are the 250-mile-an-hour cars, and I think there's always going to be an audience for that. But I think where the growing audience and the growing following and the growing participation is going to come from is classic bodybuilding as we know it today.
Because you're a contest promoter yourself, correct?
I am.
So, I mean, you must see it firsthand. The numbers, the numbers are going way up.
Yeah, the numbers are going up. We're finding it, believe it or not, that the men's open bodybuilding, the numbers are stagnant to dwindling, and we're seeing an explosion in classic bodybuilding and men's physique, the board short competitions, as some call them.
Yeah, I call it that myself. I'd like to also know, because you did so well all those years in open competition, because that's all there was. There was no 202 and later became 212. You know, you were almost Mr. Olympia. You won many pro shows. You routinely beat guys who were a foot taller, 60 pounds heavier. When the lightweight division started, which was 202 originally, did you think it was something that was kind of unnecessary because you didn't need it? Muhammad Makaway never needed it. Ben Aziza never needed it. Frank Zane never needed it. And you guys all did very, very well. So what do you think when you first saw that come out?
Well, it's not anything new, Ron. If you go back far enough, if you go back before 1976, there was an under 200-pound class and an over 200-pound class at the Mr. Olympia.
Right.
And then they did away with that. You know, I want to say it might have been 1980 that they did away with it. Not sure exactly when, but they did away with the weight classes, and it just became just basically an open. You know, so it didn't surprise me.
But do you think, so I'm asking you, do you think there's a need for it, or do you think these guys should all just be pros and compete? You know, Flex Lewis should be up there, Jose should be up there, all these guys should be up there with Phil and
I think that it could be taken one step further. I think it would be more interesting if they were combined. In other words, under 212, then maybe another category, a middleweight, if you want to call it that, middleweight, 213 to 230, maybe, and then a heavyweight and a super heavyweight, and have 3 or 4 classes at the Mr. Olympia. Why stop at a under 212? Let them all pick a class winner from each one. I think it would make it a lot more interesting and be like they do how they do all of the international amateur competitions anyway, including the national championships.
Right. So, let's go back to your career. Toward the very end, you competed less frequently. Were you starting to see that the writing was on the wall, that now we had Dorian and these other guys were coming on the scene like Paul Dillette, Nasser, Jean-Pierre Fuchs, where it was just turning to straight-up mass competition, and it was time for someone like yourself to go?
Yeah, I always said that that the sport outgrew me, and that I outgrew the sport. Yeah. Because about the same time, I felt that I had gone as far as I could go, with the tide turning and the judging system rewarding bigger and bigger physiques to the exclusion of other factors in the physique. Then I thought that the timing was right for me to exit.
Yeah. So, I know you were with Metrics for a while in the early years. When did you start getting the idea, and when did you start putting together Labrada Nutrition?
So I was with Metrics for the first 3 years. I was with Metrics, and I was one of the first 4 people there with Scott Connolly, Bill Phillips, who went on to launch EAS, and and Jeff Everson, who was, I believe, eventually was the editor of Muscle and Fitness magazine.
Right.
But in 1995 was when I broke off and launched Labrada Nutrition. So we've been in business for over 20 years now.
Yeah, and I mean, this, for people that don't know, and I don't know as well as you do how challenging the industry is, how hard was it to get the company off the ground, and how hard has it been to stay on top in this very, very competitive industry?
It's very difficult. It was difficult going the first few years. You know, literally, I was writing a check back to the company for the first 2 years. You know, so we had a rough time of it. But within 5 years, we had become an Inc. 500 company, one of the 500 fastest growing privately held companies. And then to answer the second part of your question, how difficult is it to stay on top? I would say very difficult. Because it's never been easier for someone to put a label on a bottle of whey protein and put it out there. You know, but I got to tell you that it's probably 10 times more competitive now than it was 20 years ago when I started.
So, you know, a lot of guys, especially recently, have just kind of put their name on a company where it's not even really their company. It's really a subset of a larger company.
Right.
You're exactly the opposite of that. I mean, how involved have you always been in the research, development, product launches, things like that?
Well, let me put it to you this way. We started out with 3 people in a 2,000 square foot warehouse. And I would sit behind a desk and I would do everything from the marketing to the sales to the operations to the R&D. And whenever a truck would pull up, we would basically throw on our sneakers and we would go out and unload that truck ourselves by hand because we could not afford a forklift. So I started with that, and today we've got nearly 100,000 square feet under roof, and we're distributed in over 30 countries. You know, so it's been an amazing ride, but it's been hands-on every day for me for the last 22 years.
Yeah, and you know, a guy I'm very friendly with, Rich Gaspari, is a similar situation. And, you know, this is something I ask a lot of people want to know. And looking at you right here on the screen, this always has to come to mind. You know, I'm sure it's time-wise, this is very demanding. You're probably traveling all the time. You know, how or why do you still train and eat like a bodybuilder? You still look like you could jump back on stage within a couple.
Check this out.
Oh, yeah. I've never seen you ever looking like you were more than like 7 or 8% body fat.
You know,
all these years.
Chris Dickerson, my friend Chris Dickerson, who was Mr. Olympia, I believe it was it 81?
82,
Mr. Olympia. And he once told me, once a bodybuilder, always a bodybuilder. And so the simple answer, Ron, is it's in our DNA. It's the same reason that you work out every day. You know, it's just part of our makeup, and I still enjoy it. I still enjoy looking good. Nowadays at 57, I'm kidding. I'm getting out there.
Unless people see an ID, they're not going to believe it, though.
Thank you. At 57, it's now important for me also from a health perspective, because I'm convinced that lifting weights can keep you younger. You know, so it's a lifestyle. It's a lifestyle.
So, you know, a lot of guys have made comebacks. Did you ever think about it, or were you able to really just sort of get that out of your mind?
It crossed my mind about 15 years ago. But you know what, Ron? I'm in it to help the guys that are coming up through the ranks now. The younger guys are just doing a phenomenal job, and that's what I want to do. I'm here to impart my wisdom and to help them with great nutritional products. Let's
talk about the #1 younger guy in your life, Hunter Labrada. So,
right.
So, growing up, you have a boy and a girl, correct, or a son and a daughter?
I have 3 boys.
3 boys.
And Hunter is 25. He's the oldest of the 3.
So was he always aware? You know, so he was really born when you were still actively competing and everything.
That's right. That's right. He was born in '92, so I still had 3 years on my competitive career at that point. And you know, Hunter was a little guy. It's just totally amazing the transformation that he made. Listen, Ron, I'm 5'6".
Yeah.
And when Hunter was 12 years old, I mean, he was barely up to my shoulder.
Yeah.
And probably 75 pounds, dripping wet. And once this kid, I thought this kid is like, it's just like, not only did he not get my bodybuilding genetics, but he's gonna be a runt.
Yeah.
It's like, I thought to myself, this kid got the short hand, and so when he was 16, he started lifting weights and eating, and he just exploded. I mean, just started growing, packing on muscle, and by the time that he was 18 and went off to college, he had a scholarship to play college football.
Yep.
He was 205 pounds by that time. And today, off-season weight's 250. He just competed at 235 as a super heavyweight.
Wow.
And won the Europa Games, which is one of the 2 largest bodybuilding shows in Texas.
Now, how tall did he end up being?
Now, he's 5'9" and 235 on stage.
Because, looking at him, the shape, the structure, it's remarkably similar to yours. He's basically a taller, heavier version of you.
Yeah, he is a modern day larger version. And I'll tell you, he's got certain things that are his own. His legs and his quads, for instance, the shape and whatnot are his. But there's other things that I definitely have my stamp on, and especially in the upper body.
Yeah. So, did you oversee his training, his nutrition from day one?
We worked together, Ron, on the concepts, and now he pretty much has a handle on that himself. He knows, and he's very bright. He does a lot of research and does a lot of trial and error, and he's arrived at a system that works very well for him, but remarkably similar to what I do.
Yeah, and I've watched. I believe I met him for the first time with you at an Arnold Classic. Maybe I want to say it was 5 or 6 years ago. And he was already starting to really develop at that point. I could see he was going to be.
You'll be at Olympia this year.
Great. So he's done everything very gradually, from the way he's put on the mask to the contest selection. Gradually moving up the ranks. Whereas the trend for guys his age now is to just now. They want to go from 200 to 250 in a year, and they want to move up 2 or 3 weight classes, and they all want to jump right into the Nationals of the USA. They don't want to do any smaller shows.
And then what happens? What happens is, okay, well, you got your pro card, great. Now what are you going to do? Because, you literally have at least another 5 years of training before you can get up on a pro stage and be competitive. So my advice to amateur bodybuilders watching this is take your time. Take your time. Hunter, for instance, has won his first 3 shows. The last 2 being very large regional shows. But next year, they're telling him, hey, go to the USA Championships, go to the Nationals. He's going into the juniors. So I think he needs some more experience. Could he compete at the Nationals? Absolutely. Absolutely, no doubt. But I want him to go into the Nationals to win the Nationals.
Yeah. And I have to ask you, as a father myself, I mean, you must be doing everything in your power to make sure he's doing this the healthiest way possible in 2017, and to keep him, obviously you want the best for your son. Have you been able, without going into detail, have you been able to help him avoid any things that other guys his age are doing?
I'll tell you that Hunter is very conservative, very concerned about his health, and has worked with a team of people that are conservative and are there to keep him healthy.
As seeing how the sport is today, I mean, obviously you're very supportive of him. When he first told you he wanted to be a bodybuilder, and at some point he must have said, I want to be a pro bodybuilder like you were, Dad. What initially ran through your head?
Well, honestly, just how hard being a pro bodybuilder is, in terms of a lifestyle, and also physiologically in terms of the substances that they have to use to get into that kind of condition, so those kind of things, run through your mind, but it boils down to one of those things, when your son tells you, Dad, I am going to do this, and and I'm going to do it with you or without you. I'd rather have you on board. Can you guide me? Well, you know what the answer to that is.
A lot of the bodybuilders these days are what I call power bodybuilders, where they're using all kinds of ridiculous weights because they saw Ronnie Coleman doing a video or something, and a lot of guys are getting hurt. And here you
Right.
are, 57 years old. You look like you could still jump over a fence if you had to, and
Maybe a small fence.
Just perfectly mobile, pain-free, injury-free, like Lee Haney. So, in your training, clearly you must have trained heavy, but how did you stay safe all those years?
Well, I always used a moderate weight, and there's a way that you can use a moderate weight and use it intelligently that throws the stress on the muscle. So all of the muscle, the fiber is recruited. So all of the time, throughout the entire range of motion, you keep the tension on the muscle, and you don't do ego lifting. You leave that for the power lifters. You leave that really super heavy weights for the power lifters. There's nothing that you're going to cheat yourself out of. If anything, what it's going to do is save your joints. You're much better off using a moderate weight, keeping the tension on the muscle, using proper range of motion, slowing the repetitions down, doing more repetitions. You're still going to grow. And it's going to save your joints so that when you do get into your 50s and your 60s and older, you don't have to have a double hip replacement or a knee replacement.
Cool. So, with the Mr. Olympia coming up, a lot of times, those of us over 40, we look back at the 80s and the 90s as the golden era. And, we kind of put down certain aspects of today's bodybuilding where condition and muscle quality, the detail just doesn't seem to be there as much as it used to be. So I'm going to keep it positive by saying, what do you appreciate about modern bodybuilding, open bodybuilding, and what would you like to see change or be a little different?
What I appreciate are those fellas that have the physiques, that have the lines, and especially with an emphasis on a smaller waist and the larger shoulders, so that they have more of a V-taper. So the guys that come to mind are guys like Sean Roden and Cedric McMillan. Yeah. Those type of physiques I think are more pleasing than the stockier physiques.
Yeah. So, in your personal opinion, would you like to see, if condition is equal across the board, one of those two guys be Mr. Olympia?
I think that on any given day, depending on the conditioning, one of those guys could be Mr. Olympia. If Phil Heath shows up and misses his peak, and those other two hit their peak perfectly, then you're going to have a show on your hands. Yeah. If Phil peaks perfectly, he's going to be hard to beat because he's a great athlete, because he's got the momentum as a multiple winner of the Mr. Olympia, and because of what is currently being rewarded by the judging.
Yeah. So Phil's he's most likely going to win title number 7 next weekend, or this coming weekend, I should say.
I would say that that is the indication, but again, it depends on the condition that these guys show up in. Because I think it'd be foolhardy, and especially at that level, and maybe just plain disrespectful, to write off those guys and think, well, I can show up in less than my best condition and beat guys like this. You can't. Those guys are very, very good. Right. Now, Kai was obviously the one everyone for a few years thought was going to be the one to beat him. Now there's a lot of talk that Big Ramy out of Kuwait is the only one potentially, because he's so much bigger and wider than Phil. I'm seeing improvements in him slightly year after year, but do you think he can pull it together in a year's time since last year? And so, Ron, as we're getting into discussing these fellas' physiques, and I want to emphasize that we're talking about their physiques because, with all due respect to them, most of these guys are friends of mine, and so I don't want to be critical of them as a person. What we're talking about, we're basically analyzing physiques here, and I don't think that Big Ramy has the quality and the detail in his physique to beat a Phil Heath. I think that Big Ramy is indicative of the direction, the momentum that the sport has had in the last 10 years. Yeah. Where more is better. Because he's just as big or bigger from the waist up or from the waist down doesn't mean that aesthetically he's better. In fact, if you look at a front lat spread, Phil Heath, and a front lat spread Big Ramy, certainly Ramy matches him on size. But if you ask me, his legs are disproportionate to his calves, and it just throws his lines askew. Whereas Phil has more balance. Yeah. So that's just my take on it.
Just real briefly, the Camel crew has really made big waves. Oxygen Gym in Kuwait has churned out some really great champions over the past few years.
They have.
Do you think that Americans are kind of getting, I don't want to say lazy or anything, but have these guys really stepped up their game to the point where they're challenging all the Western bodybuilders?
I think that the Middle Eastern bodybuilders have definitely stepped up their game in the last 10 years. But even back in the day when I was competing, there was a number of very, very good bodybuilders of Middle Eastern descent. Mohammed Ben Aziza was one, and you had Eduardo Kawak, who had just a phenomenal physique, was just never able to really peak and get hard enough. So that's no surprise. They have a fantastic genetic pool for bodybuilding in the Middle East, and they've gotten better at getting these athletes into shape. So it's no surprise that they're emerging as a power in men's pro bodybuilding. But I don't necessarily think that they have an advantage over the Americans.
Okay. You actually left out one of the more famous ones, who was your former brother-in-law.
That's right. Perhaps the most famous bodybuilder from the Middle East of all.
Yeah. I think you should get credit for being one of the most famous Cuban bodybuilders. Sergio Oliva always gets mentioned.
I'm a good company.
Well, you're considered more Texan than Cuban, I think. That's probably why.
Maybe at this point.
So what are you looking forward to? Actually, let me step back once more, because we talked about the Olympias, but I want to know, what was your favorite Mr. Olympia that you participated in, and why? What made it special for you?
My favorite Mr. Olympia. I would say there's several. I don't know that there's one in particular. 89, 90, and 92, I would say, probably are my three favorite. 87 as well. So there's a number of them. 87 because it was my debut at the Mr. Olympia, and I took third at my debut in the Mr. Olympia, which was not a small accomplishment. 89 because I was knocking on Haney's door there, and gave him a real run for the money. 90 because I was very close to winning after the prejudging, and it just came down to a couple of points. Although that's probably the most disappointing Mr. Olympia for me as well, because I realized at that point that they were just going to keep rewarding the bigger guys. It wasn't going to be judged on much of anything else. And then 92 in Finland, because I think that was probably my best combination of size and cuts. And it was a good showing. It was a top 3 showing.
You gave some advice earlier, but I think this is another area you might be especially helpful to some of the guys out there, because we see so many guys now turning pros as middleweights or light heavies who have really small waists and nice lines. They take a year or two off and they come into their first pro show, and now their waist is twice the size and they're blockier looking. You clearly could have gone that route. If you had wanted to add more mass on and didn't care about your maintaining that look, you could have done it. Consciously, did you know you were never going to, you never wanted to sacrifice that look?
I knew that I wanted to keep my waist and my hips as small as possible. So that was one of the main objectives in my training, and I trained around that as well. So no, I was never going to be one of these guys that was doing the 600-pound squats and the 500-pound deadlifts, and blowing out my external obliques. just to get a few pounds of exercise.
Yeah. Well, you stuck to your guns, and it paid off, because you certainly probably wouldn't have done as well as you did had you gone that route.
Let's say that I was a different bodybuilder. If all of those guys were apples, maybe I was an orange.
But in today's bodybuilding, your type of physique probably wouldn't be rewarded, because they want big, round, cartoonish looking guys.
That's right.
So you probably would be classic Mr. Olympia right now.
Yeah. Yeah, I would probably be competing for the classic Mr. Olympia. That's correct.
Yeah. So I have to think you're going to pay special attention to that this weekend.
Yes.
Some fantastic.
Danny Hester has the momentum for sure.
He does.
And he's got a great physique. Comes in hard as nails. Has good symmetry and proportion, and just a real good classic Mr. Olympia.
Yeah, and I've been talking to a lot of these guys on these interviews, and that show is actually much more wide open. It's obviously Danny has the momentum as a champ, but you have Arash, who was runner-up last year, looking phenomenal. Sadiq, Breon Ansley, Terrence Ruffin, Chris Bumstead
is always real strong, and then you've got a wild card this year. A guy from my era, Flex Wheeler, is supposed to be making.
Have you seen the recent videos of him?
I have not.
Yeah, he's finally showing the whole physique, and he looks pretty darn good.
I'll tell you what, he has genetically one of the most gifted bodybuilders in history, certainly one of the most gifted bodybuilders I ever competed with.
Yeah. And
so it doesn't surprise me that Flex Wheeler at 210 pounds looks phenomenal as a classic bodybuilder. The only wild card is the age factor. Because let's face it, you look different, in your 50s than you do, in your 20s.
Right.
But he's got great genetics, and so it's going to be very, very interesting to see how he does.
Yeah, the word classic was thrown around so much when he was competing that it's almost fitting that he would come back in classic rather than open.
Yeah, I love the story. I'm really going to be looking forward to that.
Cool. So, are you going to have a booth at the Olympia? Where can people find you?
We're not going to have a booth, but I'll be circulating. I'll be circulating there and meeting everyone. So it's going to be a lot of fun.
Okay. Well, everybody, if you're going to the Olympia, keep your eyes, keep a lookout for Lee. He's around somewhere. Grab a picture with him if you're lucky. I want to thank you so much, Lee, for taking the time. Always an honor. I could talk to you all day, but you're a busy guy, and I want to thank you for your time, and hopefully run into you in Vegas next weekend.
And I thank you for your time also, and I hope to see you at the Olympia.
And best of wishes to yourself and Hunter.
Thank you very much.
Rooting for him. All right, for the Ronline Report, it's been Ron Harris with the legendary Lee Labrada. Thank you.